Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next chapter over preserving biodiversity. As you can see here, this chapter is going to talk about some of the ways that humans impact animals and the organisms around us, and some of the ways that our activities have a drastic impact on the animals around us. So you can see here, this is an albatross, and this poor guy, he's barely even an adult. You can see he probably is just now starting to learn to fly. He's still got little fluffs on his head, but he's eaten and obviously died because of it. A cigarette lighter, some sort of long plastic, looks like a straw, some sort of thing, some sort of round, circular, plasticky looking thing, and all these bits of plastic that are all throughout his stomach. Now, this happens a lot. Things that we do, things that we throw out, activities that we do all throughout our daily activities and daily lives have unintended consequences on the animals that inhabit the planet with us. So that's what this chapter is going to talk about. You can see here, this is all the stuff that they found inside of this bird's stomach. He's barely an adult. He's probably just starting to learn to fly. He flies around, and instead of being able to tell that they're fish and things on the ocean, he's a baby. He doesn't know how to do that really well yet. He just grabs things that float. So these little pieces of plastic and things look like fish to him. So he picks them up and swallows them, thinking that it's food, and then he's unable to digest them, and eventually it kills him. So in some ways, it seems really obvious, the things that we do, throwing out plastics and things like that. But it's not always obvious the things that we do and how those things that we do impact the earth and the animals around us and the animals that live with us. So why does it matter that we want to keep these animals alive? Why do we want to keep the earth healthy? Why do we want to keep the animals around us around? Why do we want to keep a lot of species on the planet? Why is this important? So keeping every single species around is a very big deal. And it may not seem obvious that something like a mushroom or something like a cactus, just one cactus, seems like a big deal. But these cactuses live to be 200 and 300 years old, if not longer. And it takes them a very long time to be able to mature, to become able to reproduce. So an organism like that, if you lose one of them, that's a big deal in this population. Sharks are key predators. We kill thousands upon thousands of them every year simply for their fins, and also because they're scary, so we just kill them. So they're not able to reproduce enough to keep their populations high. So when their populations go down, the unhealthy fish start to reproduce, the biodiversity of the reef eventually goes down, the populations go down, and things like that. So how do we measure how healthy organisms are and how healthy the biodiversity of the population is? Biodiversity meaning the different numbers of species and different numbers of organisms that are on the planet with us. You can do it from a genetic level. Count the numbers of different species on a genetic level. You can do a big scan of the ocean, take a bunch of water, and then see what the DNA says is inside of it. You can say, oh, there's the DNA of this type of shark, or that type of shark, or this type of fish, that type of eel, and all that stuff can be found just floating around in the water. You can count the number of species that are in there, and then you can look at all of the the different numbers of species, different numbers of biodiversity at the ecosystem level too, which is really cool, and we'll talk about all this stuff in just a second. So why does genetic diversity matter? Why do we want a large population of animals that have a large population of genetics that are very diverse within it? Well, it makes sense if you ever think about it, or if you've ever worked with cattle or horses or anything like that, or breeding dogs or cats or something like that. If you start breeding mom to offspring or father to daughter, you end up starting to get genetic diseases and things like that start to occur. Bad things start to occur when you start inbreeding. And that's what's going to start to happen if you have a very small population of organisms. If you have similar genes, everybody's going to be related to one another. Everybody's going to start inbreeding if you have a very small population. But the other way around is if you have a large population, but everybody looks the exact same. If everybody is all these weasels look the exact same as this guy with the exact same genetic variation here, you can see here we've got a different color weasel, weasel with a different color, different genetics and things like that here. Well, if everybody looks like him and everybody has the same genetics, if a disease comes in, um, everybody's going to die. If this guy's going to get sick, if everybody's identical to him, everybody's going to get sick and everybody's going to die. So this entire population of weasels would die very quickly. Whereas in this population of weasels, um, there's a lot of different color weasels. You can see that here, different weasels with different genes and things like that. So maybe this guy right here with this different gene setup is going to be immune to a particular disease, where this guy would die, this guy wouldn't. So the genetic variation, the fact that they're slightly different, they're the same species, but they look different, allows some of them to survive where some of them won't, instead of everyone's living or everyone dying. So genetic variation, genetic diversity in a population is something that's very important. You want a large, healthy population of organisms. Now, this can result from things like a bottleneck effect, where a large population is removed from the gene pool, and you have a small population that has just a bunch of little d's and things like that. You can have a gene pool, a genetic bottleneck that makes the genetic diversity very small, reduces the genetic variability, the genetic diversity. But you want a large, genetically diverse population that can rapidly adapt to change, that has a large genetic differences that are more likely to be more able to quickly adapt to things like diseases, climate changes, environmental differences, and things like that, nutritional differences, when you have that large genetic variation. Because if everybody's the same, one change is going to impact everyone equally. So you can also look at species diversity. You can take a particular biosphere, a particular ecosystem, and things like that. And you can count how many species there are inside of it. So you can take like the Siberia, and you can count how many, or the tundra, and you can count how many animals live there, how many different species. Or you can take the tropics and you can count how many species live in that particular ecosystem. So the more species that are in there, the more healthy and the more flexible the environment usually tends to be. The more species there are, the more likely that organism or that environment is going to have great amounts of food and things like that. So it's very, very useful to measure how many species are in a particular area to see how healthy an environment is. And if environment goes from being able to support a lot of species, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 species at a time, to all of a sudden you now start to see 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, 7 of these species there at a time, you know that there's a problem with that particular ecosystem. So having a good species count is a good thing to know, because you can measure changes. The amount of speciation, or the amount of extinction that goes on, is going to be very important to determine things that are going on in the environment, if there's healthy changes or bad things that are about to occur. So you're probably familiar with the different ecosystems on the planet. You have things like forests, deserts, grasslands, ocean, things like that. All of those particular ecosystems are influenced by the tilt of the Earth, and the location of the sun rays as the Earth tilts around and where the sun hits them. If you're tilted towards the sun, you're going to be more dry and more hot. If you're tilted away from the sun, you're going to be more dry and more cold. And this tends to rotate around as the Earth rotates around the sun. We switch from summer to winter, and this is what that's going on here. This is the seasonality concept. So as the Earth rotates around, you can see the the sun rays hit some places equally all the time, like Africa. And that's why the tropics is where they're always going to stay pretty much dry right in there. They don't get a lot of rain. They don't get a lot of anything other than just pure sun right in there. The equator gets a lot due to trade winds and the moving of the climate. It gets a lot of rain and things like that. The tropics, and that explains why they get so much rain, because the moving of the air currents around the sun, the currents of the ocean, or around the Earth, I should say, not the sun. But it's very interesting how our activities influence the way that the sunlight that the currents move around the Earth. As the Earth warms, or the ocean warms and cools, the activities that we do cause that to change, and the currents change as well on the surface of the oceans, underneath the oceans, So we have impacts on the ecosystems as well, due to what we do, changing the currents, moving of the water, and the flow of the air. So how do we measure all of this stuff? Well, as I mentioned, you count the number of species that are found in a particular area. And as the number of species in that particular area start to go down, you know you have a problem. One of the ways that you can measure species diversity is to look at animals that are extinct in a particular area or animals that are at risk of going extinct. So animals that are extinct, you're probably familiar with this term already, means that there's no longer any more of these particular animals around. They are no longer able to be found in the wild, to be found in captivity. They do not exist anymore. The only record of them is going to be found in books and photographs and people's memories. They just don't exist living anymore. There's another version of this called functionally extinct. Lots of animals are classified as functionally extinct, which means there may be 3 or 4 of a particular organism alive, but one of them may be sterile, or the other 2 may be unable to breed, or sterile, or too old, or something like that, or they're just too unhealthy animals, so they're not able to sustain their population, even though there are living ones that are around. So they're functionally extinct. So animals at one point in time that used to have a very high number, like condors and rhinos and things, you can see how many of them there used to be in the past. We know this because of historical records and things like that. But we also know that there are drastically fewer of them today due to our activities, things like poaching, unintended consequences of hunting. These guys eat carrion that's been killed with lead shot. And the lead poisons them and they die from lead poisoning. Or they eat DDT, contaminated carrion, and they have weak eggshells and things like that. So unintended consequences that we do cause organisms that at one point in time were very numerous to now become endangered. So there's not many of them, which means they're at risk of going extinct. So endangered species means that there's not a lot of them around. They're very sensitive to our activities. Anything that we can do to help these guys along, like preventing poaching for the rhinos, preventing the trade in their rhino horns and things like that, or harlequin frogs for the pet trade and things like that. People fish tuna for food. There's very little control on how many tuna we fish. Sea turtles are run over by boats and accidentally harvested by fishing activities, and people very rarely throw them back in other countries, or they catch them for their shells and meat and things like that. So these particular organisms usually reproduce very slowly, or they reproduce it takes a long time for them to have babies, and they don't have a lot of babies at once. Or if they do have babies, in the case of, or lots of them in the case of the frogs and the tuna and the turtle here, not a lot of them are going to make it to adulthood. So these guys, all those factors are playing against them to start with. The fact that they take a long time to reproduce, they don't have a lot of babies, or not a lot are going to survive. All these things are going against them. So when they have to start playing the game with us of we're going to kill them for their horns, or we're going to put them into the pet trade and take them out of the gene pool, or they die from us hunting and leaving animals that we don't collect into the environment, they have to start playing the ball game with us. They really don't have an advantage, and they're going to start losing. So that's kind of what goes on here. So other species are classified as vulnerable, which means that they're a little more likely to become extinct. So we need to be a little more sensitive with them. They're able to maintain their population at now without our help. But if we don't continue to watch them and make sure that we don't do something silly, they won't be able to do that. So endangered species means that usually they're going to need our help to be able to maintain their lives in the wild. We need to be able to introduce more back to the wild and monitor the ones that are there and protect them to make sure that they're safe. Vulnerable species tend to be able to maintain their own populations in the wild, so we don't need to put more back in at the moment, but we need to just monitor them to make sure that they're able to do that, and we don't have to start intervening, and that's kind of what the difference here is. But at the moment, we are having an apocalyptic crisis for animals, plants, and fish, and their numbers. The number of endangered and vulnerable species is just going crazy across the globe. So, as our population starts to skyrocket, you can see here the highest number of human impacts versus the lowest number of human impact tends to go very highly correlated to where there are a lot of people. Not a lot of people in these areas, lots of people in here. Not a lot of people so much in the Amazon rainforest, in the Sahara Desert, and the outback of Australia. But in India, in China, in the UK, England, Europe, in Italy here, New York, places like that, Chicago, St. Louis, the South down in here, you can see that there's high human impact, places where there's lots of people. So the more people that are crowded into one area, the more stress that those people put on that particular environment and the organisms that are there, the more waste that's generated, the more pollution that's going to be generated, the more energy resources that are going to be needed from the land to maintain that population of people in that area. So all of these things work against us and the globe overall. The more people that are in one area, the more resources that are going to be stripped from that land, the more impact that population is going to have, the higher it is. So the best way to look at the way that we impact the world is through here, the acronym HIPPO. Habitat loss, invasive species, population of humans, pollution, and overexploitation. These are pretty much the ways that humans impact the world. And these are the main causes we are the main causes of each one of these things. When we're going to talk through those, they're pretty easy to understand. So habitat loss. Animals need places to live too. And unfortunately, when we need places to live, we often don't really much care about where the animals live, and we just kind of go in and take it. Or if we need a place to grow crops, we're just going to plow through the forest and put our crops there. Or we're going to plow through the forest and put our house there. Or plow through the forest and put a city there, drain the swamps. New York City used to be a giant mosquito-infested swamp, same with Washington, D.C. All of that was drained through rerouting rivers, rerouting streams, damming them up, building earthworks and things like that to make the water go somewhere else, to be replaced with dry land where there was none, and building houses and giant skyscrapers and things like that, and forests and fields and things all across land that was once home to something else. Well, the animals that lived in this area, they got to go somewhere else too. And unfortunately, they don't always have a place to go, or they get killed in the process. Fish, if you drain their swamp, they're obviously not going to have a place to live. Organisms that live in these trees, little tiny bugs and lizards and maybe baby birds and baby animals that are in nests and things, their trees are going to get knocked down and they're going to die as well. Maybe the adults can't outrun the machinery that's knocking over the trees, and they get killed and squished and things. So as we destroy their natural homes, they don't have places to live anymore either, which means the animals that survive this process get shoved into smaller and smaller and smaller habitats around their area, until eventually there's so many of them that the habitat can't sustain them and they all start to starve to death because there's not enough food for everyone to go around. So as we start to drain more of the environment, the organisms that naturally inhabit that environment either have to adapt, which some of them can, but most of them cannot, and they start to pay the price for that as well. So as we destroy the forest, we release tons of carbon dioxide into the environment. Now, carbon dioxide is a constant as well in the environment. It's always going to be there. The number of carbon is constant, but its form changes. Gaseous carbon dioxide, CO2 in the environment, floating around is different than CO2 or carbon trapped in the form of trees or dirt and living organisms and things like that. So as organisms grow, they remove carbon from the environment. Things like trees and plants and us as well, and we breathe, and trees respire and they suck up nutrients and things like that from the soil. They build carbon dioxide into their wood, and so do we into our body. That we are carbon anyway, not the carbon dioxide. We breathe out trees breathe out the oxygen. But anyway, they capture all of that gas carbon into their wood, Anyway, when that carbon is removed from the earth, that's a good thing. It cools the earth down. Well, as we burn these trees, we release the carbon that they hold inside of them back into the environment, which in turn warms the environment back up. So it takes thousands of years to suck it back out of the environment, trap it in trees, and we can instantly release it in about 30 minutes when we burn this tree down. So carbon fuels and things like that. When you hear people talking about carbon, that's what they're worried about. It's the CO2 levels, because it does raise the temperature. Not only that, it has a lot of other impacts on things like animals and in the ocean, things like corals and things like that, which are also drastically important to life on Earth. So grasslands are shrinking around the globe as we get rid of them due to human activity. We need water as well, so if you're in the desert and there's an oasis around you, people drain them. We have to grow crops, so water tends to be rerouted from big reservoirs, big oceans, big lakes and things. There's big underground reservoirs that cover parts of the United States, huge ones that people just drain water out of to water to their crops or to supply water to houses and things like that. So when those are changed as well, the environment changes, the organisms that live there are drastically impacted as well. So this stuff can impact the ecosystems as well. You remove the water, the trees are going to die, the ecosystem is going to get drier, or you add water in, it's going to change the organisms that are found in the ecosystem as well. So all of this stuff impacts the environment and the organisms that live around us. So one of the big ones here is pollution. And I mentioned the CO2 concept by just burning trees and things. Well, CO2 carbon is super important for these little guys, calcium carbonate, to build their shells, these coral shells. Well, carbon dioxide causes acid rain. Acid rain dissolves calcium carbonate. As the acidity level of the ocean rises, the little corals are not able to get enough calcium carbonate from the ocean anymore to build their shells, so they can't build their shells, so they die. Carbon has a lot more impacts other than just the warming of the planet. It does a lot to coral reefs and things. And if the coral reefs go away, the diversity of the ocean is going to collapse, which is going to have horrible impacts on us. So pollution comes in other forms: agricultural runoff, chemicals, pollution runoff from manufacturing plants and things like that. Anything, and it's not just going to be found in the water or the air. It can be found on the land as well, oil spills and things like that. Anything that's going to threaten life on Earth and biodiversity around the planet can be classified as pollution. So chemicals, toxins, plastic, things like that are all threats to water systems around the planet. All of these things, if you dump water or if you dump plastics and things and oil and wood and all this stuff that's got paint and all this junk in the water, that paint's going to contain chemicals that are eventually going to start leaching into the water. There's nails and different preservatives in the wood, maybe stains or some sort of metal paints and things, lead-based paints. All these chemicals, plastics, are going to start to degrade. Maybe somebody had the glues that hold these things together are going to start to degrade. All this stuff's going to start to dissolve and break down and be leached into the water. While all of that chemical stuff is going to have impacts on the animals and the people that live around that body of water. And it's not a lot of people around the globe are as fortunate as they are in the United States to have clean water and access to places that have a tap. And a lot of people are forced to resort to things like this, where they're forced to go out and get water or bathe in something that looks like this. And then the contaminants that are leaching out of all this horrible stuff, they're putting on their bodies or in their bodies or cooking with it or something like that. And the fish and other organisms that live in this environment too are going to be eating the little pieces of plastic, and their bodies are going to be impacted by all those chemicals as well. Lots and lots of ways in the United States, the ways that we farm cause lots of problems in the Gulf of Mexico, which is kind of interesting. You can see this is the big farming belts of the United States. Are also correlated to big rivers, big farming belts over here, big cities and things along this area. All of the pollution that those cities create, all the runoff from the agriculture and things that's produced out in here, all of that stuff is going to end up eventually in the big main rivers that run to the Mississippi River right here. So when it runs to the Mississippi River, all of that pollution from all these different rivers, nitrogen and phosphorus in this case, is going to be amplified, and eventually it's going to end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, all of that pollution is going to kill lots of life in the Gulf of Mexico. It's going to cause too many bacteria to grow from all of this nutrients. Those bacteria are going to suck the oxygen out of the water, which causes the fish and other organisms that need to be able to breathe the water to not be able to live. So all of this stuff has strange impacts. The things that we do to the earth have very strange impacts on the ecosystems around us. So water is a really good way to magnify chemicals in the environment. As I mentioned, it leaches things out. So chemicals that might be contained in the wood and stay in that wood for tens of thousands of years unless the wood is burned or something, are going to be leached out of the wood and move around from place to place. So you're probably familiar with this type of pollution, smog, visible haze in the air. You can see it floating around. It's going to be little particles of emissions, nitrogen oxide. You can see that here from cars, lead, things like that. Ozone that's floating around and things like that. Coal particles, oil particles, and things that are burned that are floating around in the atmosphere that are that you can see. Kind of a strange form of pollution. This can be very toxic depending on what's in it. And in some countries, you have to wear a mask to walk outside because this smog is so dangerous it can cause permanent damage to one's lungs. This is a very interesting concept here. I talked a little bit about this already with the concept of acid rain and things like that. So when you burn some of these pollutions and toxins and things, sulfur and nitrogen and stuff is going to be released into the environment. When it gets up into the air, it's going to start bonding with all the water that's in clouds, building like sulfuric acid or nitric acid and things like that. Well, that rain is going to, or that acid is going to come down in the form of rain or snow or something like that. It's going to get on trees, it's going to get on the grass, it's going to get in the soil, it's going to get on fish and things like that. And unfortunately, that acid is going to permanently damage those particular ecosystems as well. It can cause trees to drop their leaves, or it can kill fish and things like that. So acid rain is a really big deal. You can Google pictures of acid rain and see damage that it does to buildings. It eats limestone, so you can watch what it does to buildings. You can only imagine what it does to the environment. It's very interesting. So pollution has depleted the Earth's ozone layer. Now this is a naturally fluctuating hole. It does get smaller and larger over time, but it has stayed constantly larger. It does shrink from time to time, but it has stayed significantly larger than what it used to be, and that's not a good thing. So chlorofluorocarbons is the word of CFCs, is what this stands for. And these things were used to be used as propellants up until about 1970 or 80 or something like that. And they used them in hairspray and anything that needed to be sprayed out of a can, like a whipped cream, hairspray, canned air, compressed air, spray paint, things like that. So all of that stuff was released into the environment. Well, eventually what happens is it built up around the poles of the atmosphere of the planet, and it destroys ozone. It breaks down ozone, which is not a good thing. We need the ozone layer to filter out UV rays from the sun, so our planet doesn't get so hot. So the COCs eventually built up, started to eat a hole in the ozone layer, and then they banned the use of CFCs. In the, I think it was the 80s or the 90s, they banned the use of CFCs. So since then, the ozone layer has stayed the hole has stayed quite large, but it does shrink from time to time, and it's gotten a little smaller. overall, but it's still way bigger than what it used to be before these CFCs were significantly put into use. Now, it took years to show the effects of this, even though CFCs were banned in the 70s or 80s. They knew what they did once they started to see this hole show up. Now, they banned them, and then it took years to see that biomagnification concept earlier of things building up in the environment. It took years to see the effect of what could happen with all those CFCs. So this is what's going on here. And not every country banned them outright in the 80s either. It's just one of the United States and a lot of European countries. So other countries still continued to and still do use them. So the greenhouse gases, things like CO2, methane, and things like that, are going to build up in the atmosphere. And when the Earth hits, sunlight hits the Earth, it's traditionally the heat is supposed to bounce off the planet and reflect right back up into the sun, into the sky, into the space. But now we have a thin layer of methane and gases and CO2 and stuff that's built up underneath our ozone layer. Well, some of the light that hits the planet is going to bounce off, and bounce up again and hit the ozone layer. And then instead of bouncing through, it's going to hit a lot of that CO2 and methane and things and bounce right back down and warm our planet up. So all of this just bouncing up of heat waves and things is going to cause our planet to warm up, which is not a good thing. So the more CO2, the more methane and things like that trapped in the environment, the more heat that's going to be generated from these sun rays reflecting off of our planet, which is eventually going to cause our planet to become very warm, making life unsustainable through certain parts of the planet, eventually leading to life being unsustainable for most of the planet, if not all of it. Okay, so CO2 has been significantly increasing through our environment since the Industrial Revolution. People figured out that we could use things like fossil fuels and coal and oil and gasoline and things like that, methane, propane, to power industry, to move cars around, to power the world as we know it, power capitalism. The use of it is gone just through the sky, through the roof. Well, as it's burned, the carbon that's trapped inside of them, they're all carbon fuels, is released. Now, carbon sinks, as I mentioned earlier, the trees. These things, coal, oil, and gas, work as carbon sinks as well. They just hold it in the environment where it's not going to be causing things to get warm. Well, as we burn it, we release the CO2, the carbon that's inside of it, back into the environment, and then it starts heating the planet up, and it's going to take thousands of years again to get rid of it. So the more we use, the more is going to be released, the warmer the planet's going to get. So we've seen drastic impacts of this as the climate has started to warm. We have really good planetary records of the temperature of the planet for hundreds of years. And then we've started to see a drastic global increase of temperature and a drastic global decrease of the amount of ice that's formed every year in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So the amount of ice that formed at one point in time was very high, and now you can see it's gone down here a lot lower in more recent years. Well, that's a big deal if you live on the ice like a polar bear or like a seal, and you depend on the ice to feed and to have your prey and things like that, and a place to have your babies, and a place to move around. So if the ice is not there, you as a species will not be able to survive, and you will probably go extinct. Now that ice also cools our planet, so as the ice is less ice is formed, less cooling is going to be happening, which is going to lead to our planet getting warmer as well. Invasive species are a huge deal as well. Now you might be familiar with some invasive species, things like starlings. These are starlings here. Pigeons, kudzu, this is another example here. You've probably seen this one a lot. There are thousands of other invasive species throughout this country. Well, invasive species are introduced species that eventually become detrimental. Now, an introduced species is going to be a species that is accidentally brought here, or sometimes brought here on purpose. Either we brought it here on accident, and say as a little bird that accidentally flew over on a ship, a tall sailing ship, or a mouse or something that was on the boat, or a little spider that happened to have been in a thing of fruit that got shipped over, a little bug or something, or a plant that got brought over as a seed or something like that. Or sometimes people bring them over on purpose as a pet or an agricultural plant or something that people accidentally let go. Well, that's an introduced species. Well, when it eventually starts spreading and breeding in a new environment where it's causing problems, now it's become invasive. So introduced just means it's somewhere that it's not supposed to be. Invasive now means that it's causing problems and is breeding in a new habitat that it's not supposed to be. Well, these invasive species are very dangerous. They compete with native organisms, and usually they do quite well, if not better than the organisms that are there. So the organisms that live in this area, the native ones, they have to compete for food with each other. They've evolved to be able to do that. And now they have a new organism in their environment that doesn't have to worry about those same problems. It hasn't evolved there. It just gets to show up and eat things. It doesn't really have to worry about competition. It's a little bigger, it's a little better, it's a little faster. So often these guys can outcompete the native organisms to the detriment of that native organism. And the native organisms can go extinct because of it. You can see down here this kudzu has grown over the trees, which cause the trees to lose light, to lose the ability to make food for themselves, and eventually they will starve to death and die due to lack of light. In Japan and China, where kudzu is native, the trees have evolved to be able to survive this. Not so much here. Now, these invasive species can also carry diseases and things as well that can be introduced into populations that can be detrimental. There's almost 500, if not more, species of animals and plants and things that have been introduced into the United States that are causing serious problems to our ecosystems. Overexploitation is a massive problem through the animal and biodiversity problems with humans. We harvest animals faster than they can reproduce. Some organisms take years to reproduce, things like lions and tigers and things, and elephants and rhinos. And when we kill 50, 60, 70 of them a day, they can't have 50, 60, 70 babies a day. So eventually the population is going to start to go extinct, not be able to reproduce itself in time, and eventually to the detriment of the population, every single rhino killed will start to significantly impact the population of rhinos as a whole until eventually they will start to go extinct. Tigers are the same way. We've overhunted them because people demand their furs because they make pretty rugs. People make traditional medicine out of them and things like that. We've overhunted them. We've over-destroyed their habitat. And to the point where these organisms cannot sustain themselves anymore in the populations in the wild. And then sometimes they're just accidentally caught as bycatch through the process of fishing. Things like sea turtles and dolphins and porpoises and things are just accidentally going to be grabbed up through nets that don't care what they catch. And in some countries, the fishermen are not necessarily as keen to take the time to grab this little sea turtle out of the net and throw him back in the ocean. They might just throw him off to the side if they fish him out of the net at all. And then that poor little organism would die and then not be able to go back into the environment. Now, one fishing boat doing this is not a huge deal. One tiger dying is not a huge deal, but if you think about the fact that there's 15, 20,000 fishing boats across the planet that are doing this every single day, people that are poaching tigers, leopards, lions, rhinos every single day, they start to add up. Then organisms start to have drastic impacts from us, especially slow reproducing organisms. So sometimes you can fix these problems by spreading awareness. So DDT is a chemical that was used to prevent the growth of bugs and lice and things. It was used as a pesticide for up until 1972. It was used for a really long time on plants and things, spraying for pests. Now, what we found out as DDT is introduced into the environment, as it gets into the water, bugs eat it, plants, it leaches into the water. Fish will eventually eat bugs that have eaten plants that have DDT on it, and the bugs transfer the DDT to the fish, and the fish eventually will end up transferring DDT to bald eagles and things that eat them. Now, birds, when they eat fish that have lots of DDT inside of it. It's that bioamplification process again. DDT impacts birds, hawks and raptors, owls and eagles and things like that. Other little songbirds, they don't eat fish so much. But it causes their eggshells to be very brittle. So the adult organism would sit on an egg incubated and it would just instantaneously crack. So the populations of bald eagles almost went extinct in the 70s and 60s because of this DDT use. Now, once people figured this out, we banned the use of DDT. And bald eagles started to recover because they were able to have babies and reproduce and repopulate themselves. So sometimes awareness of these problems can fix this, and taking action to remediate what we've done to impact these species can allow them to be able to reproduce and recover their populations back to a number that's healthy. In the case of the bald eagles, they were eventually removed from the Endangered Species Act, which is really cool. So lots of ways have been established to help maintain this. Now, dams, as I mentioned earlier, you dam up a river, fish are going to have a hard time getting around this. So there are lots of ways that people have come up with to help remediate these problems. Now, this is something called a fish spillway here. And this is how to help fish get around dams. You can't go over it, but you can go around it, which is kind of cool. So they make a little sidewalk for fish to go around the dam, which is pretty neat. There's lots of things where they've gone in and they've tried to reproduce and restore an environment that's been damaged by humans and clean it up and restore it to what it looked like previously and things like that in an effort to fix the problems that we've done. And to help maintain these areas, to encourage biodiversity, to maintain that biodiversity and that healthy populations. And sometimes you can reverse those species declining in that area. So sturgeon have to go around a dam, big fish. When you dam up the river, they can't go around it to reproduce anymore to get to their spawning area. So when you build a big ladder for them, they can go around it and get around to their new to their old mating habitat, their old mating area. And now you can reverse that species decline, which is pretty cool. Individual species need to be protected, which is super cool. And each species is different. Knowing what each species requires to protect them is different. If you need to protect an individual from poaching, like a rhino or an elephant, you can pass laws to encourage to prevent poaching. You can encourage people to hire rangers to protect these organisms, to protect the parks in which they live in. You can encourage ecotourism, which is encouraging people to come into these areas to watch these organisms, which brings money in to these areas. And when these areas have money, they can better protect these organisms. And then eventually, hopefully, we will be able to clone extinct animals and bring them back from extinction. Things like the dodo or rhinos that eventually will go extinct through hopefully not in our lifetime, but eventually they will. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, and things like that eventually will be brought back from extinction, the passenger pigeon. But when we bring back animals that are gone, we have to ask ourselves the moral question of, are we doing something that's proper? We're not really protecting the organisms that we have now. Do we really need to bring back more of them? Should we do a better job of protecting the ones that we have instead of worrying about bringing back ones that we've already destroyed? And that's kind of a different little here nor now, or here nor there or later, whatever you want to say, question for a later date. So it's really interesting to figure out how to deal with preserving biodiversity. If it's going to be on a political level, a citizen level, and all of these ways to legislate this and things, it's very difficult to figure out how to handle this. As an individual, I try to live my life in just a way that I try my best to just not have as much of an impact on the globe as I have to. Things that I can do just to prevent, driving too much from place to place, or making unnecessary trips, or just not buying things that I know come from a bad source, or buying lumber that has been harvested illegally and things like that. So just try your best to maintain sort of a taking a little extra time to recycle your can instead of just throwing it out the window at your car. The biggest thing in my book is you have to go to a gas station anyway. Every gas station on the planet has a trash can. You have to get out of your car to pump the gas. Just wait till you get to the gas can or the gas station to throw your trash away. Just don't chuck it out the window. And that's a big one that we can do all just to prevent all of these problems with animals and people interacting with one another. So that's all I've got for this PowerPoint. If you have some questions or anything you want to know about it or want me to elaborate on anything, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to do so. If not, have a great rest of your day.